Uh, as I said, was born in 1954, and so I'm completely a Cold War baby. I grew up absolutely in the midst of this and was trained and imbibed all of the legends of the Cold War. And my wife, by the way, was born in Prague, so she was born in Soviet-dominated Central and Eastern Europe. We know all about that. She shook hands with Gagarin, actually, after his orbit as a young pioneer in Prague when he came for a heroic visit. So this was absolutely the milieu of my upbringing. The American idea and the European idea and the NATO idea was that we faced an implacably expansionist, ungodly, totalitarian, communist, international movement, and that we were defending freedom and democracy against the expansion of the Soviet Union. I would say that was taken as 99.9% by Americans and Europeans at the time. And I crossed Checkpoint Charlie twice in Berlin. I saw the Berlin Wall with my own eyes as a young person, of course, on many occasions. So the world seemed to be divided, and the foe on the other side seemed to be implacable. And just to translate till today, communism is gone, the Soviet Union's gone, but the rhetoric about Russia is almost identical to the rhetoric of the Cold War period, as if there's no change. Okay. But my point is, even that Cold War vision, if you grow up and spend decades studying, learning, working on both sides, working in Moscow as I have, working all over the world, but especially in these two sides of Europe, the whole Cold War narrative is a huge blunder and tragedy in its way, because there's another story to it that's completely different from the one that you and I grew up with. And that story is the Soviet at the time, until today, the Russian search for security. And we don't give this one moment's thought. And I can tell you, I didn't even hear 1 minute of it growing up or going through university. And I had a good university education at Harvard, undergraduate and graduate school. I didn't hear one day, not one day in my life as a student, that there was another side to the Cold War story. Now, I may have taken the wrong classes, but I'm telling you what the atmosphere was, which was an implacable foe. We read Solzhenitsyn. We knew about the crimes of the Soviet Union and so forth. We never stopped to ask one moment, well, 27 million people in the Soviet Union died at Nazi hands. What is the implication of that for the aftermath of World War II? What might have been done? What were the Soviet or the Russian security concerns at the time? Now, since then, I've spent 30 years pretty much in depth in understanding these issues. And it's a point that I really want people to understand. When you lose 27 million lives, or China, by the way, with its military victory parade today, China lost a comparable number of lives in its war with Japan, which, by the way, we never discussed one day in my youth. The fact that China, I mean, I knew that China was invaded by Japan, but anything about the actual war or the scale of loss, not a moment. Okay, coming back to Europe, the Soviets or the Russians said, how do we protect ourselves against another invasion against a remilitarized Germany, round 3, because after all, the First World War was a German war in part on Russia. The Second World War was Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, 27 million dead. And the Soviet side said, we need a peace agreement that addresses our security interests. And the United States essentially said no. And Britain said no. And we know even in the spring of 1945, Mr. Churchill was already asking about the possibility of, maybe just the possibility of, invading the Soviet Union, our wartime ally, in Operation Unthinkable. It's pretty much unthinkable that your ally has just lost 27 million people, and you're asking your war command about maybe we should invade this fall, because the implacable hatred of Russia went way back. And in Britain, it went back to the 1840s. And this is part of our story. The United States absolutely rejected a core agreement made in Potsdam at the end of the Second World War for a demilitarized, unified Germany. And instead it said, we'll take our part, the 3 occupied zones by Britain, the US, and France, so-called. We'll build that into a new Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. We will remilitarize it, and it will join NATO, our new military organization, in 1955. And all of this time from 45 onward, the Soviet Union rightly is saying, but excuse me, what about our security? We just lost 27 million people. That wasn't a distant history. That was an immediate reality in which the US was remilitarizing Germany. And if you go back now, as I have for many, many years, and look at choices that were made, we had many diplomats led by George Kennan in the United States who said, take the deal. A neutral, demilitarized Germany will end the Cold War. The Soviet Union tried to prove it again and again, including most notably in Austria in 1955, when there was an agreement. Austria would become neutral. It would not join NATO. The Soviet occupying forces left Eastern Austria and never bothered Austria again. They were saying to the US, do the same for Germany, and the Cold War ends. But the US-UK idea was bloc mentality. And this is why what's happened in the last 35 years is so poignant, because what President Mikhail Gorbachev at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s was about fundamentally was ending that division by ending the 2 military blocs. And to do it, he went first and disbanded the Warsaw Pact. And in the US and UK mentality, which is crazed in its way, I have to say, they said, oh, that's not peace. We just won. We won. Now we can do all that we've always wanted. And so formally, World War II was ended in 1990 because the United States had rejected a treaty to end World War II up until the reunification of Germany. In that reunification, the US and Germany explicitly, unambiguously said that NATO would not enlarge. It should have said NATO is ended, but they said NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. Terribly, Gorbachev did not put it into the 4+2 treaty because he said this is a treaty not about NATO, but about Germany. So there's a reason it's not in there. But the commitment was no more NATO. But the American and British mentality, and I add the British, they had no weight in military terms, but in psychological terms, we were living the British imperial dream. but just as the American empire. As soon as Germany was reunified, the United States, without losing a beat, said, now NATO goes eastward. We won. We are the military alliance. And we would never listen one moment to the Russians say, but we're not at war. We just disbanded. Why are you pushing NATO? We're not supposed to have any NATO enlargement. And the U.S. attitude was, as you absolutely know, you are a third or fourth rate country. You count for nothing. We'd like to pump your oil for you, so we want Chevron and Exxon to be there. Other than that, you are a, quote, gas station with nuclear weapons. You will listen to us. You have no choice. And the grand poobah of that theory in the 1990s was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was, by the way, to me, a very nice man, because I was advising Poland and he helped me in the advice, to get my advice actually implemented, and it worked. But when it came to Russia, he was a true Polish patriot. He hated Russia. That goes back to the 17th century. And he hated Russia. So in 1997, he laid it all out as clearly as it can be laid out. Expand NATO, expand Europe. Russia will have nothing to do but to exceed, because it could never join with China. That's unthinkable. There's a whole chapter in his book about why Russia won't sign up with China. So we have falsehood and delusion, a complete one-sided story about the Cold War itself, which is really wrong historically. And then after 1991, we have the grandiosity of supposed unipolarity. And now we have the idea, since that unipolarity didn't exist and Russia has its security interests, now we have the return of the most primitive kind of Russophobia imaginable. So Europe meets, as you note, every 2 or 3 days in terror of Russia, with these fools around the table, without talking to the Russians at all. And so it is this self-fulfilling, grandiose, delusional sense of power and vulnerability together, and thinking that the United States will pull them out of, bail them out, pull them out of this fire and protect them from the Russian bear. And as you said completely rightly, this incredibly stupid set of demands, for example, on India, which I think is probably the single stupidest moment of foreign policy of modern America that I know of, that was promoted by the Europeans. So you were completely right to point out that, yes, Lindsey Graham had the idea, quote unquote. Donald Trump implemented it, but the Europeans were desperate for it. Secondary tariffs, secondary sanctions, stop the Indians. So all of it is such a bad misreading of history, of current events, of tying yourself in knots, of failing to look at a map, of failing to do the most basic arithmetic of world population or technology or industrial production or direction of trade. And if you just watch these people, they don't know anything, and they don't want to learn anything, and they don't want to hear anything. And especially in Europe, the most desperate thing is, for God's sake, don't talk to the other side. It may be a little annoying. And so we actually have a spectacle of grown people like Starmer, Merz, Macron, grown people that won't even have a discussion with President Putin. Not a talk, not an idea, not an honest exchange.